So, our next speaker is Andreas Bummel. And someone told me this morning when they first met him a few years ago that they considered him simply to be a burgeoning force of energy. So there's your introduction to him. Andreas Bummel is a consummate activist. He is the co-founder and director of the Berlin-based Committee for Democratic United Nations, and he is also the coordinator since 2007 at the campaign for a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, which you'll be interested to know is endorsed now by 1,400 former and sitting members of Parliament. Thanks to Andreas. Your podium, sir.
Well, thank you very much. It is a delight and a pleasure, an honor to be here at this conference. Global problems require global solutions. This is the key premise of the conference. Exploring and implementing such solutions is the motive behind the remarkable efforts of our host, Andreas Schwarzberg, who is just arriving. I wish to congratulate him on the establishment of the Workable World Trust, on the organization of this excellent conference, and of course on his book, Transforming the United Nations System. The topic of my presentation today is the establishment of a World Parliamentary Assembly. This is a subject that Joe has been working on for a very long time, and that's why it's a real pleasure, I have to stress again for me, that he has asked me to talk about this subject today. Effective and legitimate decision-making bodies are the foundation of a workable world order. In the introduction of his book, Andreas Schwarzberg observes that the design of decision-making institutions has an important bearing on the quality and legitimacy of the decisions they make. From this it follows that society will be inclined to provide well-designed institutions with greater responsibility and greater resources. As Joe writes in his book, this can set in motion a virtuous cycle that will contribute significantly to the evolution of a more workable world order. A World Parliamentary Assembly, on the one hand, is a means to democratize the UN and the system of global governance, but it is more than just this. We expect that the Assembly will be an important agent for fundamental change. It is a key to initiate exactly such a virtuous cycle that not only leads towards a more democratic, but also towards a more effective system of global governance. The need for global political integration and the World Parliamentary Assembly stems from two of the most important trends of modern time. This is first the trend towards democracy on the one hand, and then the process of globalization on the other. I wish to begin my presentation with a brief overview of what that means. The rise of democracy in the world is one of the most remarkable trends of our time. In the year 1900, there was not a single country in the world that provided for universal suffrage and that we would consider democratic today from this perspective. 50 years later, after the Second World War, a third of the world's population lived in 23 countries considered democratic by a Polity for Research project. And today, around 60% of the world's population live in democracies. We continue to witness what researchers have called the third wave of democratization. Since the end of the Cold War, the number of electoral democracies as counted by Freedom House Foundation in Washington, D.C. rose from 69 in 1989 to 125 this year. This is the highest number that Freedom House Foundation has counted so far, 125 electoral democracies in the world. Today, democracy is almost universally recognized as the only legitimate form of government. At the 2005 World Summit of the United Nations of Heads of State and Governments, for example, it was reaffirmed that democracy is a universal value based on the freely expressed will of people to determine their own political, economic, social, and cultural systems and their full participation in all aspects of their lives. This may be cynical or not, but it's a stated, official view. It is true that there are different understandings of what democracy is, and it comes in many different forms. But international law and human rights norms describe some fundamental principles. For instance, Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 states that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government, and that this will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be held by universal and equal suffrage and by secret vote. Article 25 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights provides that every citizen shall have the right and the opportunity to take part in such elections, as well as in the conduct of public affairs directly or through freely chosen representatives. Democracy also has overwhelming popular support in the world's population, as empirical studies show. The World Values Survey, for example, conducted between 2005 and 2007, measured an average global approval rate of 92%. There was no big variance across world regions or cultures. Democracy has become a universal value, but at the same time, if we look at the state of democracy today, there is a lot of public discontent and dissatisfaction. This is not a contradiction, quite the contrary. People strongly believe in democracy as an ideal form of government, but they are dissatisfied how this idea is put into practice. The tension between the belief in democracy as an abstract principle and the disappointment with its practical implementation is what we can consider a democratic deficit. Now, the process of globalization is feeding an ever-increasing democratic deficit. 11 years ago, then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan established a panel of eminent persons that was tasked to explore the relationship between the United Nations and civil society. The panel's report, that was quickly forgotten by member states, contained a striking analysis of the nature of a global democratic deficit. According to the panel, one of the root causes is the absence of parliamentary representation in global governance. The panel noted that elected legislators and parliaments seem to have little impact on decisions made intergovernmentally, and they, hit it on the nail on the head. According to the panel, the dissatisfaction with the performance of democracy is strongly linked to the perception that traditional forms of representation are less relevant in this age of globalization. In fact, agenda setting and decision-making on important policies are shifting to the UN and its specialized institutions, as well as to international fora such as the G8, the G20, and so on. But the decisions of these bodies are prepared by highly inaccessible officials appointed by the executive branches of national governments. Intergovernmental bodies are largely disconnected from parliamentary oversight, participation, and deliberation. International treaty negotiations are often conducted in total secrecy by faceless department officials. Today there, for example, is a huge demonstration in Berlin, gathering 250,000 people demonstrating against the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And one of the reasons why the people go to the streets is because there was absolutely no transparency about the negotiations and its contents. The democratic deficit in global governance is also visible in popular dissatisfaction with the outcomes. This is, output legitimacy, as it is called by political scientists. International opinion research carried out over the last decade shows that the world's citizens are much more receptive to global solutions than their own governments. And this also concerns the United States, I have to say. Majorities in most countries, for example, support a strong regulation of the international arms trade. They support an international responsibility to protect people from gross human rights abuses by their own government. They support the elimination of nuclear weapons, and this is the case in all nuclear powers. And they also support more government spending to fight hunger and extreme poverty, and they support a higher priority of climate change mitigation. The view of government officials is limited if it comes to finding global solutions. Their task is to advance their government's particular interests as best as possible. But the lowest common denominator of national interests is not equivalent to the common interest of humanity as a whole. What is lacking today in the system of global governance is a body that is truly able to take on a global perspective and to represent the voice of the world's citizens. What's more, effective global rulemaking is impaired by one of the most fundamental principles in international law, namely by the concept of sovereign equality of states. From this concept, it follows that the creation of international law through intergovernmental treaties is based on consensus. It is at the discretion of states whether they choose to join or not to join a treaty. This is the reason why international treaty negotiations mostly revolve around finding the lowest common denominator of all states that are involved. A solution would be to move towards qualified majority voting in certain policy areas. But then we are confronted with further issues. According to the principle of the equality of states, each state has one vote in international decision-making, no matter how large or small. In the General Assembly, all 193 member states are equally represented. Based on this, it is often assumed that the General Assembly has a strong moral authority, at least, and that there is much talk of the Assembly's so-called revitalization. 7 years ago, the then President of the UN General Assembly even suggested that the Assembly should be able to adopt universally binding law. But from a democratic perspective, this would be a very bad idea. In reality, the UN member states are not equal at all. As Joe Schwartzberg has pointed out in his book, despite the universality of its membership, the present allocation of power in the Assembly utterly fails to reflect the distribution of power in the world outside the United Nations itself. In his book and previous publications, he has suggested a method of weighted voting based on three principles, namely population size, contribution to the UN's budget, and legal equality of nations. The problem is caused by the dramatically uneven distribution of the world's citizens among the UN member states. The principle of one state, one vote collides with the democratic principle of one person, one vote. A few figures demonstrate this situation very well. In theory, the 128 least populous countries in the world are able to pass resolutions in the General Assembly with a two-thirds majority, but they only account for 8.4% of the world's population and only 11.2% of the world's gross domestic product. In addition, the 65 least populous countries that account for not even 1% of the world's population are able to block a two-thirds majority vote in the General Assembly. Then the 10 most populous countries alone account for nearly 60% of the world's population, but in the General Assembly they only have 10 votes, which is about 5%. The bottom line of this is that the 13,000 inhabitants of Tuvalu have the same weight in the UN like 1.3 billion Chinese. But we need to realize that the situation is even worse than these figures suggest. The government delegates at the UN do not even represent the entire population of their country. At best, those they represent are those people who voted the government into power. The opposition parties and minorities are not represented at all, and provided that there are democratic elections at all in countries. Based on the long-standing recognition of democracy in various international treaties and instruments, Thomas Frank argued already 25 years ago in a seminal article that there is a right to democratic governance. Today it is clear that such a right cannot be limited to the national level, to national governance. The essence of democratic governance, as it was affirmed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, means that those who are affected by a decision need to have a chance to influence this decision. At the very least, those who are affected should be able to freely elect their representatives. It cannot matter at what level of governance a decision is being taken. If the right to democratic governance was limited to the national level, this right would be unduly eroded when decision-making shifts to the global sphere, but this is exactly what is happening today. As Anne-Marie Slaughter observed, international government networks already can and already do perform many of the functions of a world government, that is, legislation, administration, and adjudication, but without the form. In several remarkable resolutions adopted by the General Assembly since 2004, the existence of a right to global democratic governance was confirmed. Among other things, it was stated by the General Assembly that every single person is entitled to a democratic and equitable international order, and that this involves transparent, democratic, just, and accountable international institutions in all areas of cooperation. And most importantly, that this involves the right to equitable participation of all without any discrimination in domestic and global decision-making. But how can we achieve the participation of all in global decision-making? So far, the General Assembly hasn't said anything about this. The obvious answer is through popular representation in the World Parliamentary Assembly. The idea of a democratically elected international parliament is not new at all. It was first voiced during the French Revolution in the 18th century, and proposals for the establishment of a UN Parliamentary Assembly were already put forward in 1949. After the end of the Cold War, the idea developed more momentum, and in 2007, the International Campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly was established, a network of parliamentarians and non-governmental organizations that coordinates and strengthens the efforts internationally. A UN Parliamentary Assembly would have the purpose of giving elected representatives of the world's citizens a voice in political negotiations and decision-making in global intergovernmental organizations. Its function would also include democratic oversight of the UN's administration and operations. The members of the Assembly could be directly elected or appointed from among national or regional parliaments in the first step, but in the long run, the members of the Assembly should be directly elected by the world population. The members of the UNPA would group in transnational political associations and groups, and not by national origin, and thus would transcend non-dimensional national interests. In a first step, the UNPA could be set up by a vote of the General Assembly according to Article 22 of the UN's Charter, which means that a cumbersome reform of the Charter would not be necessary, which would be subject to a veto by the, might be subject to a veto by the permanent members of the Security Council. At the beginning, the Assembly could be vested with all rights that the General Assembly has, but in the long run, the idea is that it would develop into a main body of a reformed or transformed world organization. A key to understanding the idea of a UN Parliamentary Assembly is to conceive of it as the beginning of a process and not as a final goal. One of the examples to draw upon is the development of the European Parliament. I do not have time to go into this in detail at this point, but the key to understanding is that the European Parliament developed from a largely consultative body in the 1950s that was composed of national parliamentarians to a directly elected parliament that is today a real legislative body in the European Union. And more than that, the European Parliament at critical junctures in the process of European integration, played a critical role to bring the process back on track. At the beginning of the 1980s, for example, governments could not decide on many issues, and decision-making was paralyzed since all governments had the ability to block decisions through a de facto veto right. Unanimity was required. In 1984, the European Parliament presented a draft constitution for a federal European Union with a real legislature that was based on majority voting. This forced the governments to come up with their own proposals for institutional reform, and over time, majority decision-making was introduced in more and more areas. We believe that the World Parliamentary Assembly could play a similar role in the transformation of the global system. One of the key elements World Parliamentary Assembly would address is to allow for majority voting, and this puts the allocation of seats in the Parliamentary Assembly high on the agenda. A workable world order eventually will have to include a global legislative system that is capable of determining universally binding regulations. For global rules to become universally binding, I would like to add, it would be useful to add another layer, namely national parliaments. I mean, first of all, I have to say the UN Parliamentary Assembly is to be conceived as a complementary and additional body to the General Assembly. So the idea is that the General Assembly would, even in a transformed world organization, in a way would stay in place as the body that represents states and governments, and the Parliamentary Assembly would be an additional parliamentary body. In the allocation of seats, it is obvious from what I have said that population size necessarily needs to be taken into account. In an initial step, it is necessary to balance the weight of small countries and large countries, just as it has happened also in the European integration process. The European Parliament, for example, the allocation of seats in the European Parliament, for example, is based on the principle of digressive proportionality, which means simply that the large countries get smaller seats per capita than the small ones. And an example is Malta, and then I will come to an end. One example is Malta, that has 70,000 inhabitants per member of the European Parliament. And Germany, as the largest country in the European Union, has 833,000 per capita. It means that one member of the European Parliament in Germany represents 833,000 inhabitants. Sorry about that. The idea is that step by step the powers of the Assembly would be expanded, and in this process the democratic requirements would increase. It needs to be said that there is a broad agreement that popular elections are the precondition for vesting the Assembly with legislative powers in conjunction with the General Assembly. I'm coming to an end. According to Robert Dahl, it is possible to speak of three big transformations in the history of democracy. The first transformation occurred around 500 before Christ, when the autocratic city-states in Greece developed into the first political systems that included democratic decision-making. The key institution was the People's Assembly, a gathering of all eligible men at the time. For the next 2,000 years, democracy was identified with small city-states and direct participation of the citizens. This changed when the second transformation happened in the 18th century. In the course of the American and the French Revolution, the principle of democracy was expanded to large territorial states. The key was the idea of democratic representation. What followed was the trend towards democracy that is still advancing today. But what we are now witnessing, ladies and gentlemen, is the beginning of a third transformation. As global interdependence grows and critical issues can no longer be solved by states acting alone or even bilaterally, the nature of government and rulemaking is changing fast. Transnational government networks already fulfill the function, if not the form, of world governments. Just as it was difficult to imagine in the 18th century that democracy would be possible in large territorial states, it is still difficult for many people today to imagine that democracy can work at the global scale. But the emergence of a democratic and workable global order is exactly what the third transformation is about. The most important milestone in this new revolution is the establishment of a World Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you very much. Questions for sure? Shall I take them? Yeah, it's difficult to see because of the light.
Who's first?
Ready to go? Okay, the thing is, you have mentioned interesting aspects of deficits, democratic deficits and similar things. All right, thank you. And the problem is that in these areas, in Western Europe and the United States, say North America in general, and some scholars would say these are not actually democracies, these are oligarchies. So this is one aspect. The other aspect is that when you are talking about the assembly, global assembly, parliaments, I think the problem is that, first of all, there must be human equality in economic, political, and social rights in order to implement this high level of institution in the globe. But given the disparities today, I don't think that would be possible. And the idea is good, but I think first of all, we must clear out the differences and don't talk about government on the planetary level. Without this, I think it becomes only theoretically beautiful, but so beautiful that it is not true. Thank you.
Shall I respond directly or collect questions? Maybe a few more questions.
Hello? Yeah, there we go. Does your model require the implicit assumption of every country having to be a democracy? Because a majority of countries are not democracies. So how can we achieve this parliamentary assembly without every country being a democracy?
Yeah. One more question, maybe here at the front. Oh, I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
I think it's very important that you're talking about representing all the people of the world. That I'm Arthur Kanigis, the producer of the movie last night, The World Is My Country. And, oh, thank you. And one of the things that Gary Davis was talking about is how all the people can be more participating. You know, now with the web and the internet and everything, that he's saying we don't always need a middleman, that we can directly be involved. And you talked about the city-states being the origins of democracy. Is there some way as we move forward toward a world parliament that it can not only be sending representatives to meet in a body, but can be interactively having the people of the world on their Twitters and webs and so on, interactively being engaged in a whole global conversation?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, okay.
If I could just tack on something. I would like to hear more about the practical aspects of the campaign and how you're building support for UNPA.
Okay. Okay, so basically 4 questions. One, how can we want to pursue a world parliament if there's such, inequality in the world? Isn't that unrealistic? Then question, is it necessary in this model that countries are democratic? What do we do about undemocratic countries? The other question is, well, parliamentary representation is good, but how about direct participation? Yes?
Or how that can interact with it.
Yeah, how can that interact? And the other question, just practical aspects, I guess. What is the state of affairs and how do we do this? How do we advance this? What's the strategy? Yeah? Okay. In this order, well, as I said, the most important point in this is to understand that this is a process that would begin, well, very modestly, through the establishment of a consultative assembly that would not have legislative rights at all, but that would have a certain kind of oversight function in the system, and it would connect parliamentarians with the UN stronger, and it would hold the bureaucracy accountable and so on. and step by step, it would develop only into the direction of a body that is actually capable in conjunction with the General Assembly to adopt in certain areas and under certain conditions international law that is binding. So it may be true that I have stressed this vision a lot, but that is what actually is the raison of this whole movement. We don't want to create a little body that stays like that, but we are driven by the vision behind it. And I agree that global legislation will probably require more changes in a cultural way and in the values in the world population, you know. But I cannot say more about that right now. Is it necessary that countries that are participating in the Assembly are democratic? Well, the overwhelming majority in the international campaign says that by definition, a UN Parliamentary Assembly needs to be open to all UN member states without regard to how they are organized, whether it's democratic or not. And that has certain reasons. One reason is that if this assembly is legitimately going to supposed to deal with global problems, how can you exclude countries and under what criteria? Who would measure actually which country is democratic or not? You see, so you come into a lot of problems. And the thing is that if we look at the numbers, the analysis provided by Polity for Research project or Freedom House Foundation, the thing is that we are at a point in the third wave of democratization that a large majority of countries is considered electoral democracy. And that's why we believe that at the beginning, when the Assembly only has consultative rights, it makes no difference, you know. Otherwise, you would have to reject the General Assembly as well, you know. So it is, and for some countries that are considered autocratic, they still do have a vibrant opposition. And the Parliamentary Assembly in this regard is looked at as a body that would actually strengthen the national democratization processes, because it would involve exactly these opposition parties that are otherwise are not, have no opportunity to be heard at the international level. Direct participation is a very good example for how the model of a UN Parliamentary Assembly has developed over time, because just in our last international conference of the campaign, exactly this matter was debated, and we came to the conclusion that we need to study in earnest how methods of liquid democracy can be connected with the work of the members of the Assembly. One of the reasons is that if such an Assembly has maybe 700 to 900 members as an upper limit, beyond which it would be ineffective, you know, you can, it's a simple matter of math to calculate how many how many members there would be per capita, and that's, you know, in the millions partly. So there needs to be systems to establish a better connection. This is one system, but we have to work out how that exactly could look like. And another system might be to establish some kind of ombudsman, you know, models within the constituencies. How does this look in practice? Well, the strategic goal that we have as a campaign is to achieve a majority vote in the General Assembly, or to convince a majority of UN member states to establish an international treaty that could create the body. And how do we achieve that? Well, this is a multidimensional problem or challenge. Governments at this time are hesitant to embrace the idea, particularly because foreign ministry bureaucrats, they immediately recognize, you know, that this body would make their work more difficult, since it is supposed to ask questions and to, you know, exercise oversight. And they consider the system to be complicated enough for them. But what we will require is, at a trigger point moment, like it happened when the Berlin Wall fell, we need a trigger point moment at which we have a network in place that can facilitate two kinds of revolutions, as I would like to call it. One is strong popular grassroots support from the bottom. You know, the world citizens themselves will have to you know, embrace this idea and put pressure on governments, for example, through online platforms like Avaz, and we've been talking with Avaz, so that's not completely, you know, far-fetched. But then we need another dimension, which is enlightened, progressive leadership from the top, from the elite, you know. Like Mikhail Gorbachev supported the grassroots revolutions in Eastern Europe in a way, you know, by saying that the Soviet Union this time will not militarily intervene to support the toppling governments. We will need enlightened leadership at such a trigger moment again. I don't know at this time where it could come from. But one scenario that I've been thinking about a little bit is that which you might consider unlikely, namely that this enlightened leadership might come from China after a democratic revolution in China. You know, so there are 2 points to consider. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not anticipated. There might be geopolitical moments ahead that we do not anticipate as well today. And one of these things is the end of the one-party rule of the Communist Party in China. And in China, there's an interesting development in international law because they have a long tradition of, you know, they do not have the starting point of a division of the world in states. They rather have a starting point of looking at the whole world as a whole. And international relations scholars in China are looking into this. So there is already some groundwork that is happening right now that a new democratic government in China could build on. And I mean, this is just a scenario. I'm not saying that this is happening. I just want to stretch your minds that there might be trigger points in the future which we do not anticipate, but in a way we need to be prepared. And this is the strategy of our campaign. We don't believe that us knocking on the doors of UN ambassadors will bring about a parliamentary assembly. The precondition will be, you know, a trigger point moment and a real shift in the geopolitical setup of the state system, probably.